Hello, everyone, and welcome to the UNB Law Podcast. My name is Michael Marin, and I'm the Acting Dean of Law at UNB. We begin all of our events by recognizing and respectfully acknowledging that the UNB Law community gathers on the unsurrendered and unceded traditional lands of Wolastoqey. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Ann Gushurst, who is a graduate of the UNB Law class of 1994. Ann is Senior Counsel and Vice President of Griffiths Law PC, just outside of Denver, Colorado. Throughout her career, Ann has established herself as a leader in family law, litigation, mediation, and collaborative law. Her passion for the fight for civil rights has led her to pioneer many LGBTQ family law issues, including serving as co-counsel in the case against Colorado's Defense of Marriage Act. Ann is admitted to the federal court, and in addition to general domestic law, she also handles Hague Convention custody cases. Ann is recognized in the top 100 attorneys in Colorado Super Lawyers, and is also a member of the top 50 women attorneys in Colorado Super Lawyers. In 2015, she was recognized as Ally of the Year by the Colorado LGBT Bar Association for her groundbreaking civil rights work. She has also been recognized by the Best Lawyers in America 2018 to 2020 and has been named top lawyer in family law in Denver by 5280 magazine for 2016 to 2020. Ann Gushurst is a superstar UNB Law alumna, and we're so pleased to have her here on the podcast. Welcome, Ann. Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure, Michael. That's an intimidating rollout, can I just say?
Well, it's a stunning career, and we want to explore that with you. Part of the purpose of the podcast is to connect our community, and in particular, inspire our students who are going through a little bit of an uncertain time right now. So having you on and exploring your career path is really valuable to us. Before we get started, though, I understand that this is your last few hours of quarantine. How does that feel?
So exciting. I can't barely discuss it. Yeah, 2 weeks ends in 55 minutes to be exact.
That's great. So do you have, other than doing this amazing podcast, do you have any plans for after the quarantine?
Well, the first thing I'm going to do after this is I have a family law executive council meeting by Zoom, and then my grandkids are all coming over for supper, so I'm very excited.
Fantastic. That's perfect. So maybe we'll start by talking a little bit about your life before law school. So can you tell us where you're from originally, where you grew up?
I can. I was born in Denver, Colorado, and my parents went through a very messy, horribly conflicted divorce when I was 6, and my mom moved us to McMaster, Hamilton, Ontario. So I did my remaining grade school and high school in Hamilton and went on to U of T and did a degree in physiology, actually. And then married my college sweetheart and moved to St. John, New Brunswick.
Wow.
Yeah.
And when did you decide to become a lawyer? You studied physiology. Was law sort of always in your mind, or? Okay.
Absolutely, not even remotely. I was actually more interested in medicine, and I actually got accepted once to medical school, but gave it up to get married, which was an interesting decision. Anyway, when I was pregnant with my youngest daughter, my marriage fell apart, and I realized that I had 3 kids, and what was I going to do? And going back to school was really the only option. And so I applied to law school, mostly because my father-in-law was a judge, and I'd always really enjoyed debating issues with him. He was a Court of Queen's Bench judge in St. John. And anyway, that's how I ended up in law school. It was sort of like, oh my God, what can I do? And yeah, it wasn't very deliberate.
And so you were living in New Brunswick at the time. So is that why you chose UNB Law?
It's partly, obviously I had 3 kids, so the idea of moving was a huge consideration. But at the time, I was, you know, I also considered U of T and York, but obviously UNB at the time had extremely high rating, and it was close, and it wasn't going to disrupt my family situation. So yeah, that's why I chose UNB.
Wow.
But I was very much aware of how good the law school was when I chose it.
Do you remember your first day of law school? What that was like?
Oh yes, oh yes. It was similar to today. I was like getting out of stay-at-home motherhood prison. So just for context, when I went to law school, I had a 1-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 5-year-old, and I had literally spent the last 6 years pregnant or nursing. So um, I was just, it was so exciting to be back on a university campus talking to actual adults and people who, could go to the bathroom by themselves. It was just exciting.
That's fantastic. Were you nervous at all, or were you just sort of just happy to be with adults? But yeah, were you like, because a lot of the time, first year law students, they're scared, they don't know if they belong. Were you feeling that way, or were you feeling, oh, I'm just relieved to be here with adults?
I was anxious, but probably not the same sorts of anxiety. Like I wasn't afraid of the academics, and I wasn't afraid of the social. I mean, I had been through so much change in the last year. That part of it wasn't anxiety producing. The idea of being on my own and creating a career and all that sort of stuff, that caused quite a bit of anxiety for me.
Yeah, so later on in law school.
Well, just the whole idea of, going out on my own and doing school instead of, looking for a job, postponing earning money for 3, 4
Right.
years. Yeah.
Right.
And could I do it and be a mom? That caused quite a bit of anxiety. But the first year of law school, when we went, was just mornings, 9 to 12.
Oh.
So yeah, it was just 3 hours, and I was like, this is a piece of cake. So little did I know that you have to spend 6 hours a day reading, but uh, reading's easy when your kids all go to bed at 6.
So is that sort of how you would plan your day? Like, what would your typical day look like in law school?
Well, my recollection is that the first year Ingrid only was in preschool, which was interesting because I was in McGee House, so right next door to the little school there. I think it's Montgomery School. And so I would get the kids up. I had a babysitter in the married students residence, which worked out great. I'd drop Ingrid off. I'd go to classes. I'd come back, make the kids lunch. There would be naps, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, so it was actually really easy. It was like 3 hours without the kids. And there were a bunch of the hydrology engineering schools at UNB, and so their very students' residence was full of engineers and their wives and families. So I always had ready baby care. It was great.
That's fantastic. And so you mentioned UNB Law. So the schedule now is actually quite different. Our first year students are going to hear 9 to 12. What? That's amazing. We wish it was 9 to 12 now. So now they actually go later on into the day. But can you tell me a little bit more about what UNB Law was like when you studied here? You graduated in '94.
The law faculty were amazing, like by and large amazing. I really enjoyed my professors. I do remember, I think we had is criminal law first or second year? I think it's first year.
First year now, probably back then as well.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was. We had Dan Hurley. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but I'm guessing you probably have.
I have
For a midterm exam, he decided to spoof everybody, and I think 80% of the correct answers were C. So people were writing the exam and freaking out. Anyway, so.
I've heard Professor Hurley was quite a character, and that anecdote certainly fits with the perception that I have. So, and it's interesting that the 9 to 12 idea, because we're trying to figure out ways to become more accessible, obviously, to people in different family situations, work situations. Some students increasingly are caregivers to parents and have all sorts of family obligations. We've talked about a part-time program as well. So it's interesting that our timetable used to be 9 to 12 like that. We'll definitely consider something along those lines because we're trying to become more accessible, I think. And then also, COVID is creating an expectation of accessibility as well with everything being online.
Yeah, it was very convenient for me, and it was also convenient for one of my girlfriends, who's actually a very prominent attorney, Natalie Godbout. She worked the entire time she went to school, and it was really important to be able to. She worked at the KEG, I think, to be able to get to work. So for those of us, and I also worked part time, having the 9 to 12 schedule for the first year was really helpful.
That's really, really neat. That's really, really neat. So you mentioned Professor Hurley, and he's known to be quite a character. Do you remember any other kind of funny or noteworthy events that happened at UNB Law, stuff that we can share for public consumption?
Well, yes. There are so many stories. I remember the first day we had Professor Gocknauer for torts, or it could have been torts or legal procedure. I can't remember, one or the other. And he gets up on the desk, and apparently he was a Vietnam draft dodger from the States. He gets up on the desk and sits in the lotus position, and everybody is like looking like, what is going on? And started telling a story about telling a story. So I think it was advocacy that he was teaching. But I mean, nobody could get over the fact that here was this guy in blue jeans sitting in the, cross-legged on his desk. Yeah, my favorite first year story actually was the one I was very interested in. I'm a very intellectual person, and a lot of people were struggling, but I was like so excited to be in the class and asking tons of questions. And there was a guy who actually sat in the first row, who became a really good friend, Nando DeLuca. Anyway, and I usually sat in the back row because I was chronically late. Anyway, but between the two of us, we'd always have our hand up. And so at one point, Professor Townsend took us aside and said, the process and the journey is really important for the other students, and you guys are asking too many questions and blah, 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 blah. And I was like so taken aback and very, on the verge of tears, actually. And Nando was like, I don't care. I paid my tuition and I'm going to ask as many questions as I want. And I was like, oh yeah, that's how I feel too. Yeah, law school was, I have nothing but good things to say about law school. My hardest class was contracts. For whatever reason, the idea of how contracts are formulated legally was difficult for me. Everything else was sort of interesting and fun. And I had some trouble in criminal law because you're just dealing with rapes and murders all the time. And here I am with 3 little kids, and it was like gruesome. I actually got up and left that class multiple times to go throw up. But other than that, law school was great.
That's great. If I think about my time in law school, one of the things that I regret is that I was so focused on the outcome. I was so focused on grades and getting a job and stuff that I didn't really have I didn't really focus on the process and the learning and the experience. I did later on in law school. So that's sometimes something that I tell students, focus on the experience, because you're only going to ever get to do this once, and it's a great experience. That's something that I regret, that I try to encourage students to focus on. Is there anything that you would do differently if you were to do law school all over again, or you're pretty happy with how things went?
Yeah, I guess I didn't think about sort of what I was going to do next very much. This was just sort of put one foot in front of the other for me. And in hindsight, maybe I would have taken trust in states for sure. I think I told you that yesterday.
Yeah.
But other than that, like I really got a lot out of law school. I looked at law school as getting the secret decoder ring that finally explained how everything works. And I think most attorneys and law students are focused on litigation as the primary manifestation of how you work in law. And that's just wrong, because the vast majority of attorneys don't go into litigation, but they do go into government and they go into companies, and they, law is the language that allows commerce to work. It's the language that we use to form our society. And when you look at it from that perspective, the type of broad-based approach that UNB has always taken is extremely helpful. In the States, the law schools, you specialize from year one. You can even get into law school based upon wanting to be in a specific program. And I just think that's very short-sighted.
Right.
But I loved law school. I loved being there. I loved learning. I loved the debates. It suits my personality. And I like what it teaches you about how we as a society value things, and maybe how we should think about changing how we value things, because the law arose out of protection of property rights, basically, in England, and property is far more important and codified and protected than a lot of other things that maybe modern societies should be interested in protecting, like human rights.
Right.
The right to work, the right to have security, blah, blah, blah. So that's sort of the reflection of having practiced for, 26 years now. It's very, very sad to be getting old.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned, so it sounds like the broad-based curriculum is something that you saw as an advantage at UNB Law. It's something that we still see as a core part of our brand. And we hear that so much from alumni. And one anecdote I share is that my wife, who also teaches the law faculty, she went into family law like you. She practiced family law for a number of years. But when she was in law school, and she went to another law school, we won't name it, but she loved family law. And so she took all of the courses that she thought were relevant to family law, like constitutional law, obviously family law, advanced family law, all of this sort of stuff. She did some mooting, but didn't take any business law course. No tax, no business, no trusts, no wills, none of that stuff. She gets out into the real world and realizes, oh my God, she's at a big disadvantage, because actually this is a significant part of family law, and her law school, unlike ours, never forced her to take any of those courses.
Like, I can't even tell you the advantages that it gave me. I mean, I'm mostly in the realm of dealing with people who went to U.S. law schools, where people take very, very segregated courses in whatever they're interested in. And of course, everybody thinks they can do family law. So every time there's a recession, we get all the civil attorneys and criminal attorneys dipping their oar, so to speak. They have no idea. And when you do high-end divorces, which is the kind that I, sort of specialized in, if you don't understand formation of business, if you don't understand trust law, if you don't understand what fiduciary duty is, it's really hard to give your clients good advice without bringing in other professionals, which of course everybody hates paying lawyers to begin with.
Yeah.
The thing that you can only know one area of the law ignores the fact that the law acts as a huge thing. And so we in family law routinely have business issues, routinely have estate issues. There's criminal law comes to bear. Bankruptcy right now is a big thing as well. But there's just all arenas of the law that you need to know. And for example, I think it was in property law that we learned about writs. Well, I know what a writ is, and I understand the abolishment of writs and where you find them and how they interact with legal rights. But the vast majority of the attorneys I practice with have not even heard of them.
Wow. Well, that's great to hear. I want to talk to you a little bit about what happened after law school. In the intro, obviously I noted that you've become a leader in family law. Is that something you were always interested in, or did that develop over time?
Oh, hell no. I was not the least bit interested in family law. but it's funny. I did my, I forget what course it was, but we had a senior project on, maybe it was family law. I don't think it was. Anyway, I did a big, huge paper on mobility rights. So I did do some higher level work in family law, but I was not interested in doing it just because, you know, my parents went through a divorce. I went through a divorce. The last thing in the world I wanted to do was divorce. And I started out at Gilbert McGill and Gillis in St. John, which was the only law firm that made me an offer, which is another story. And I realized that, you know, working full time in a general practice was fairly difficult, and it wasn't so much the law work itself, but the expectations of a larger firm are difficult for single parents. Anyway, my dad got sick, so I moved back to the States to take care of him, and I actually went in house for a couple of years and did telecommunications law. And there was a lot of Canadian American stuff between energy and communications. So there was a sort of a niche there. But then I decided to go out on my own. And anyway, there are really three types of practice you can do in the States without being in a big firm. One is bankruptcy, which is not something anybody like me would be good at. And one is criminal law, where, you know, it's very, you're dealing with criminals and there's a lot of after hours work, and the natural place to go was family law. Plus, one of the women in my circle of friends was a paralegal for family law, so that's kind of how I ended up in family law. It also was not a deliberate decision of, oh my God, I want to do family law the rest of my life. But it's been a good fit because, like I said, if you have an interest in the bigger picture, like there is no bigger, you know, stage of human drama and emotion than family law. It's been an education every day of my career.
So I'd love to explore that a little bit, because you kind of fell into it. It wasn't a deliberate choice, but then you excelled at it, and you kind of reached the top of the profession in that field. What do you attribute that trajectory to? Was it a matter of just finding something that you loved and were passionate about, or was it, you know, your work ethic or motivation? Because a lot of people like just sort of do a job because they have to, and you stumbled into this not knowing that it's what you were passionate about, and then just took off. And I'm wondering how you explain that.
I guess I'd have to think about that. I have a passionate sense of justice, like a very strong streak of being intolerant of injustice. So, and family law is difficult that way because it is increasingly overburdening our judicial system, which was designed to not really deal with divorce. So, you know, we talk about family law being the ugly redheaded stepsister in the legal profession. Everybody sort of looks down at you. It's not the highest paid. I mean, I've represented people that were, you know, billing out at $1,000 an hour in mergers and acquisitions, and you know, they laugh at what the rates family law attorneys charge are. But I guess what really got me going in family law was realizing the tremendous impact it has on people's lives and the scope for, you know, getting the legal system to be better. I've been involved in, for example, the Law Society here, the Colorado Bar Association. I've been on the Family Law Executive Council. I think it's 16 years now. I've been on all kinds of committees to try and make the process better for children. And human rights is a huge part of family law that most attorneys ignore. And so when you think outside the box, you can make tremendous changes. For example, in Colorado, we have the Uniform Parentage Act, which is separate from the Divorce Act. And they sort of have an awkward relationship with each other. One's more for neglect cases and establishing adoptions and paternity outside of marriage, and one is for, you know, kids who grow up in marriage. But the assumption in both statutes is that a child who's born of a legal relationship is a legal child of those two parents. And so when you had the situation where our laws were not recognizing same-sex marriages, one parent in all of those cases had no legal rights to their children, like none. And so realizing that I was representing a woman who had been in a same-sex marriage, and it was just a tragic story. Their relationship fell apart, and the other mother took the child and moved out of state, like out of the country. And the court said, like, you're not a legal anything to this child. And I thought, this cannot be right. And so first I found a legal theory to establish a legal parent-child relationship with this child and this mother. And it was the first time that had been done in Colorado, and the second time only nationwide.
Wow.
And then I convinced the LGBT bar that we should sue the state and change the law. And we did.
And this was the Defense of Marriage Act litigation?
So that's one of the reasons why I dislike Bill Clinton.
Right. Well, I want to explore that experience for you a little bit. I've heard from some lawyers and sometimes law students, when they're confronted, for the first time with significant injustice, and they realize how embedded it is and how difficult it is to change. How do you sort of get the strength to fight that? I mean, where does that come from?
I think that's part of somebody's personality. Like, I'm the kind of person that doesn't take no for an answer very easily. You can ask anybody who knows me, and you should probably start with my children. And I can be relentless when I see something that needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
It's hard. I remember once there was this judge that I absolutely disliked, and she threatened to hold me in contempt of court 3 separate times. I got to the point where I would check in with the other judge and leave my purse with the clerk and say, please call my law office if she actually throws me in jail. She was kind of a nut job. I shouldn't say that. But she once said to me, like, Miss Gushurst, are you trying to tell me what the law is? And I was like, yeah. Isn't that my job? I thought that was my job. Am I not supposed to be doing that? And but it takes a lot of courage to stand up and change things. And I don't know that I have more courage than other people. Because there have been times I've been in court, I've been absolutely terrified. But the anguish that happens when you represent somebody who is getting the raw end of a really unfair process or law is very motivating to me.
So having that client there who's counting on you, it's hard to focus. I mean, you're feeling certain emotion about the process as well, but you have someone who's depending on you. So totally. Yeah, so you can't dwell on yourself too much. I know you're very interested in ADR, and so I'd like to talk a little bit about that as well. I mean, how important is ADR as an alternative to litigation, to this kind of scenario where it's zero sum and maybe one person technically wins, but at the end of the day, everyone's worse off, versus a more collaborative approach?
Well, that's like 3 questions in one. So
please unpack.
So part of this is that the law reflects society, right? So society, you can change the law, but if you don't change the underlying assumptions, things don't really change. And the best example of that is no-fault divorce, right? So when people go through a no-fault divorce, that feeling of being vindicated doesn't appear, like they don't get to tell their story. And so you can do whatever you want to minimize the conflict, and we no longer have the private detective who goes and takes a picture of in flagrante delicto, which was a mainstay of law here and in the States. But the feeling of wanting to be vindicated and wanting to be heard and wanting somebody to say it wasn't your fault, that feeling doesn't go away. So ADR is important. because it's a modality for us to change that expectation. Unfortunately, most people doing ADR are attorneys, and we are in a black and white think pattern. So we approach ADR the same way we approach litigation. And really, for ADR to be transformative, it has to be transformative. You have to get away from the win-lose mentality. You have to, it's the difference between having a pie between two people and cutting it and giving one half to, and the idea of sharing the pie without having delineations. So it's a much more complex thing. And attorneys are trained to think of things in a very analytical way. Professor Walsh, Kathy Walsh, I don't know if she's still there. She was the person who said to me, and I didn't really understand it at the time, but I understood it after. Law teaches you to think of things differently, and she's right. But unfortunately, the law ignores the emotional reality of the people seeking solutions. And from that perspective, it's very incomplete. It doesn't do somebody a lot of good to get a wrongful death law, amount of money if what they're upset about is that they weren't treated with respect. And it doesn't help to win sole custody of your children if you end up damaging them because they don't have a relationship with the other parent. And you can't be a co-parent with the other parent if you've trashed them in court. So it's just so nuanced, and law is not nuanced. It's fairly black and white, and that is a problem when it's applied to human beings.
You said that part of the problem with ADR, a limitation of ADR, is that the people involved are attorneys. Do you think that it should be other professionals, or we should be changing the way we train lawyers in order for ADR to work properly?
Yes.
Yes.
Look, it's a debate in the collaborative law community where I'm from, whether or not you can be a collaborative attorney right out of law school before you learn all your bad habits, or whether or not you need to understand the legal underpinnings of divorce and have practiced in that arena legally before you can do good collaborative law. And at times over the years, I've been on both sides of that debate in my own mind. And the other thing about law that's particularly problematic in the context of family law, or even medical malpractice, which is what I did before I went into family law, is that we present fact finders with only the facts we think are relevant. Well, having somebody make decisions for children who don't understand, psychology and child development is dumb. It's just dumb. Right. So do I think attorneys should be trained differently? Yes and no. I mean, I think that they should still understand the legal standards, but you can't be a good family law attorney if you don't have empathy. You just can't. And, if you don't understand the damage you do psychologically to a family system, that's a big problem too. Some of the most prolific family law attorneys are people who are on the spectrum because they don't have the same sort of empathy, enmeshments, and problems that other people have, which makes them very efficient because they don't care, and makes them in some ways better because they don't get enmeshed. But they can end up having very, very bad results for families.
Mm. Can I ask you then, as someone who is very empathetic, and you must bring that into your practice, how do you not get too affected personally and emotionally by the cases that you're involved in?
Okay, you do notice that I have pure snow white hair, right? So the answer is, I wish I knew.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. That is a dilemma. And, the other dilemma that you have as a family law attorney, and I suspect it's true in other arenas of law, is putting too much emphasis on settling, because if you waste all your clients' resources on something that a settlement where settlement isn't going to work because they're not going to ever agree, or you have to give up too much, Or, I have a case right now that I've had for 5 years. We should have litigated it. We should have litigated it because these parties needed somebody to say, stop the nonsense. Here's how it's going to be. And it's been nonstop litigation ever since because, they keep trying to bargain and they're so into their own heads and so oblivious to how ridiculous this is. We've spent millions in that case. Oh, I once had the largest legal bill in the entire state for family law.
Oh my goodness.
It was terrible. They spent over $2 million on that case. And this is like 15 years ago. Yeah. But anyway, we've since been eclipsed multiple times, but.
And the cost of family litigation is striking, when you consider relative to the resources that the average family has, right? Like when the breakdown of a marriage goes badly, it can consume everything, it seems.
Oh yes, yeah. I have at least one case now where the guy's in bankruptcy, and COVID helped, but he would have been in bankruptcy anyway. Actually, he filed before COVID really hit, but all of his resources have gone to defending being a parent. It's just insane. Human beings are crazy, which is why we have jobs. So you have to be careful how much you go down that road.
So it sounds to me like you can never really separate yourself emotionally from your clients, but I suppose. And in fact, probably your emotional connection to your clients is one of the things that has made you very successful, I would imagine.
Probably. You have to be really careful not to become enmeshed with your client's perspective.
Right.
Part of being a zealous advocate is giving your client advice that they need to hear but don't want to hear, and that's what a good advocate does. And you cannot be objective if you're completely sucked into the mindset of your client, and perspective is really important. Having empathy so that you don't pick a fight your client doesn't need, that's important. Understanding your client's needs is critical. Because people feel very vulnerable going through the loss of a divorce. It's a loss of identity, it's a loss of parenting time, it's a loss of financial resources. And if you don't have empathy, they are going to feel brutalized, not just by what they're going through, but by the process that you're taking them through. Right. But I think many of us, and myself at times, have erred one way or the other, not caring enough, caring too much. And so you just constantly are trying to balance that. But I think the same is true in almost any type of representation that has emotional ties to it, which most litigation does. Two big corporations, that's a different kind of conflict. But somebody who's suing because of malpractice or a boundary dispute or, property or criminal court, it's all very personal to the people going through it. It's not just family law.
Yeah, I can relate a little bit. I started my career in corporate law, corporate litigation, and I was interested in my work. I never really identified personally with any of my clients because they were big corporations, and I wasn't senior enough to actually have any face time with the client. But then when I came back to Canada, I practiced labor and employment law, and I represented ordinary people, and that's what I wanted to do. And that for me was the biggest challenge, that shift in mindset. All of a sudden, I had this person who was really counting on me, who I cared deeply about. And sometimes, as you say, you have to deliver the difficult message. Your claim is only worth this much. If we push it, you're going to eat all of that up in legal fees. It's time to settle. Or, I think you have a really strong case here. I know this is hard, but let's push a little bit further. So it's an interesting perspective that you're sharing that I think a lot of lawyers can relate to. I wanted to get back to the equal marriage litigation because, as you suggested, it's kind of like an ongoing process, right? Like you have a win, or not really a win, but progress, let's say we call it, but then you realize that there's much more work to do, or that there's something left undone. Well, what do you think is the next kind of frontier in equal marriage in the U.S.? Like what's the next thing that has to be accomplished?
Well, honestly, not a lot, but the last frontier for common law marriage jurisdictions, which Colorado is one, is ascertaining that once the law was struck down as unconstitutional, it was void ab initio, meaning that it was as though it never existed. So we are now, we've just had 3 cases, 2 of which were same-sex couples, go before the Supreme Court on certiorari to determine, can the court retroactively recognize a same-sex relationship that had all the hallmarks and indices of common law marriage. And the hard thing for that, there's 2 parts of that. One is, how can people be married during a time when they knew that they couldn't be? And I think the court's going to answer that marriage is an act. And if you're acting married and you're supporting each other and you're doing all these things, you're married whether or not you said in your mind, I'm married, which is problematic because, as you know, the crux of common law marriage, I mean, we learn in Canada it's the 4 C's, but it's the consent to be married and actually living a married life, cohabitating, consummation, capacity, and consent. So consent's a big part of that, right? But the second problem of that is, in Colorado, the Seminole case requires that there be a bit of additional proof, because there's that notion that you have to be wary of people who could have gotten married but chose not to. Are we trapping people who didn't intend to be married? And that's a huge problem in today's society, where living together doesn't mean you intend to be married to that person, or having sex with them doesn't mean you intend to be married. Owning joint property doesn't, having children. We've just changed so much. The flip side of that for same-sex couples is, if you are living a closeted life, how are people going to recognize that you've been in a committed marital relationship? Because our test is that not only do you have to have consent, but you have to have lived openly and held yourselves out to the community as being married. And we run into that problem quite a bit. People who could have lost their jobs if they were openly out as being in a same-sex relationship. And it's ironic, but the week before we argued this in front of the Colorado Supreme Court, the case of Bostock was decided at the US Supreme Court, which held that it is unconstitutional to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. And that actually isn't exactly what they held. They held that discriminating against somebody for the fact that they are not having relationships with people of the opposite sex was sex discrimination, which is unconstitutional. And that nuance is going to actually turn out to be fairly significant in the US. But, I could argue and say, like, up until last week, it was legal to fire somebody for being gay. Like, it was. So these people weren't out to their friends or their pastors or their, family. So if you get the aunt to come in and say, well, they never acted married, you have to also inquire, like, well, do you recognize gay marriage? Are you prejudiced? So there's a bunch of undoing of past prejudice, and the problem is, that is more of a shift in societal norms than it is a shift in the legal reasoning. So I think that the next frontier is going to be actually that as couples get together going forward, both same-sex and straight couples, more and more of them are not getting married. But that doesn't mean that they don't have children and that one person doesn't, sort of take on the brunt of this part of the work and not this part. And what happens, like, I've got a case right now, parties have been married 30 years. And, the one spouse who's got everything in their name is saying, you're not entitled to anything. Well, okay, great. So what, we're all going to put these people on, welfare and food stamps because one person wants to keep their wealth? It's a very complex thing. But I think that in terms of what we used to argue for LGBT couples, which was joint endeavor, quantum merit, unjust enrichment, detrimental reliance. All of those arguments are going to shift from being just LGBT relationship arguments to being everybody's arguments, because people aren't getting married at the same rate, but they're still enmeshing their lives. So it's a bigger question than the law. It's a question of how do we organize as a society.
Yeah, and I know that there has been some litigation in Canada over that as well. So I think you're right that it seems to be a societal issue as well. I know that you've done a lot of this work pro bono, and I want to talk a little bit about that, because we have programs at UNB Law, Pro Bono Students Canada, that tries to sort of instill an ethos of pro bono work. Can you talk a little bit about how you see pro bono fitting into your overall practice?
Well, I mean, a fair amount of my practice has always been pro bono, and one of the great advantages of my law firm is that they made it possible for me to support myself and do pro bono work. And for that, I give them a tremendous amount of credit, because for me personally, I would have not lasted this long had I not had that ability to do the cases I really thought were important. The problem with pro bono is really an access to justice issue. And, in Colorado, we have the Metropolitan Volunteer Lawyers Society, and also the Colorado CLR, Colorado Legal Representation. I'm not really sure, because most of my cases come from outside, and then I go to them and say, hey, I'm taking this case. Because I concentrate my pro bono work on appellate work. The problem is that if you create the idea that everybody's covered because we're doing all this pro bono work, you ignore the bigger problem that law is increasingly out of the financial means of people who need it. And that's particularly true in probate and family law cases, because it's one thing if you're in business and a contract goes sour, that's part of your business model, but you don't have any choice when you are sued for divorce or your parents go through a divorce. And to say that some people are more protected than others based upon what they're willing to sacrifice financially doesn't ring very authentic to me. And it's ridiculous that people are giving up their children's college educations in the States for a divorce. It's nuts. When I do an estate that's a couple, $10, $20 million, okay, that's not a problem. I'm a drop in the bucket in the bigger scheme of things. But when you got two people who have a house and retirement savings and that's it, it's a travesty. And as you layer on top of that the fact that people who are unreasonable tend to have inordinate success in law, because if you're relentless and you don't care and you're a little bit nuts, the law pays attention to you. And that's unfortunate.
It's interesting. Your experience with pro bono at a U.S. firm, sort of similar to mine. I started my career in the United States, and I was struck by how pro bono work was encouraged in my firm. I don't know if it's at all firms, but we had a target that we had to meet. My funny story around this is there was a partner that I was terrified of, who I worked on a few of his files, but he had a corner office. He was a very fancy lawyer, and I was very scared of him. I was a first-year associate, so there was a prospect of us potentially winding up in the same bathroom together. So I avoided that bathroom all the time. It was like my worst nightmare would be having to be in the bathroom alone with him. So anyways, I was very intimidated by him. And but I had a pro bono case. It was a wrongful eviction case, housing, in New York. And I had a deposition coming up, and our annual pro bono target was, the deadline was coming up as well. So I was going to do the deposition, but this partner that I was terrified of called me and said, Mike, look, I'm about 10 hours short on my pro bono target. Here you have a deposition coming up. Can I do it, or can I come with you? you know. And so of course I said, oh yes, it's all yours, like you can have it. But what struck me about that is even one of the top partners, rainmaker really, at a big law firm, still felt compelled to do his part in terms of pro bono. And I don't know whether that's like a cultural thing among all American lawyers, if it's more prevalent here or there or in Canada, but it's something that struck me. And I'm just wondering what you think either law schools or the legal profession or maybe law firms need to do to encourage more pro bono. Like what works in terms of encouraging this kind of pro bono work?
That is such a hard question to answer. I mean, obviously, as a profession, we are all about preserving wealth. I mean, that's what the law is geared around, to be honest. And so pro bono doesn't fit in neatly into that equation. And I do a lot of pro bono because it sort of like saves my soul. But there are many, many attorneys, and even attorneys in that I've been very close to who do virtually none. And I draw a distinction between involuntary pro bono and pro bono that you choose to do. And involuntary is when your client runs out of money and you are in for a penny in for a pound. And that happens a lot in family law because we can't do contingency work. We are required to do it on an hourly basis. And if you got the downside spouse, sometimes you take the gamble that, they're going to get half the marital estate so they can pay you at that point. But that is not really pro bono, and that's not really helpful to the bigger problem of, people in poverty have the worst issues, the most complex legal issues, and they don't have access to the law. And it works a disservice to all of us when you have people who get crushed in legal proceedings because they didn't have representation. I don't know how to compare the ethos between Canadian attorneys and American because I worked such a short period of time in Canada. I do know that in general, and maybe it's because I worked such a short time in Canada, but my perception of how people are collegial is that Canada does a much better job of encouraging that and holding people to standards of practice. I still remember Tom McGlone saying to me, about sharp practice, and he was kind of my mentor on that at the firm I clerked at. And I just don't find that translates quite as much in the States. There's a maverick mentality, especially in Colorado, that, we just go out there and we fight and, it's sort of a burnt earth policy. And I don't know, I think it's a very individual thing, people's willingness to do pro bono. There are certainly the younger attorneys in general do more than the older attorneys. So I think there's been a change in the law schools and how people see it. But, again, I say pro bono is great. And one of the things that I did personally to try and encourage it is I would teach at the Colorado Bar Association on how to get fees awarded in pro bono cases. I did that course 2 or 3 times to try and encourage attorneys like, look, if you get fees awarded, we can donate them back to MVL. But the more you prop up the idea that there will always be people who don't have access for fundamental issues, the more you perpetuate the fact that we have an access to justice problem. And I don't know what the solution is, to be honest. I have been on several task forces looking at access to justice and looking at how we can make family law better for families. And, we flirted with the idea of doing sort of like a workman's compensation administrative process that was much more institutional. But there's really big, huge problems with that too, because the level of the standards of appeal and the standards of, remedies are limited in the administrative law world. And that also works in equity. So I don't know, I don't know.
In our last segment here, I'd just like to see what advice you might have for law students. I mean, we've talked so much about the rich career and experiences that you've had, and that's going to be inspiring for them for sure. Do you have any other advice for them? Like what should they be focusing on in law school, you think?
I think one of the most important things about a legal education is understanding the historical context of what the law does and what it set out to do, and to analyze how that serves or doesn't serve present day society. You know, it's funny, a lot of people ignore administrative law, but it's critical, and you have to understand the brilliance of it and the limitations of it, and you have to understand how legislation works. And you guys are so blessed here because this is a bilingual province and you have an actual place where people who are trained look at legislation to see if it makes sense. That's not how it works in Colorado. I once got pulled into a legislator's office who was subsequently booted out for violating a domestic restraining order, but that's another story, and said, like, you know, we're litigating this call center stuff, and, you know, and I'm like, well, you're going to put all our employees out of work. Well, work with me here. And I'm like, you know, I am not trained to write legislation, but, you know, you have people who are plumbers and they get elected in the States and they draft bills and it becomes law. And nobody looks at that to see if it makes sense or if it's dovetailed with other policies. I mean, here in New Brunswick, you have like the best system ever, because people look at it, they translate it into the other language, and they make sure that it fits and it's coordinated. The thing about law, I mean, obviously conflict resolution is a lot of what we do, but law is a lot of other things too. It's how we, you know, how we regulate things. Regulations is a huge area of law that isn't taught. Like there's no course on how regulations work. I once had to sue the Department of Health of, no, what was it? DHS, Department of Health Services, to get their regulations published, because they enforce child support, and it's a long story, but you know, they were telling me that I had to exhaust my administrative remedies, which, by the way, thank you, Professor Townsend, I knew what that meant. But I had to sue them to get them to publish the regulations that my client was subject to. Like, there's just so many areas of law that we don't think about in law school because we're thinking about law and order, and we're thinking about the courtroom scene, but law is everywhere. It's the fabric of our society. And my advice to law students would be to look at that and, you know, to realize that it is so much more than litigation. Litigation is the tip of the iceberg in terms of how law impacts us. And you really need to have the bigger perspective, because as an attorney, you will be impacting other people your entire career, even if you just do litigation. But there are, you know, you have so much to give back to our society in terms of potential and understanding and helping be part of the solution and not part of the problem. That's my advice.
I want to ask you a quirky question here to close.
Okay.
When I was doing the research for this, I noticed that you were on the Dr. Phil show.
Yes, I was.
You're probably, well, I don't know anyone else, any other UNB Law alum who was on like a leading sort of daytime American talk show. I don't think I know anyone, let alone one of our alums that was on such a big show. I mean, Dr. Phil is like an offspring of Oprah. There's no one bigger than Oprah. So I have to ask, like, can you tell me a little bit about that? What was that like?
Oh my God. Well, you know, it's so funny because up until a couple of years ago, the episode we were on, which was called Anatomy of a Divorce, was the most highly watched Dr. Phil episode. Wow. And it was 3 episodes, and I was in the first 2. Anyway, it was fascinating that they gave you like mobile cameras where you could record. There's one they install in your car, so if you're taking calls in your car, they can record it. And you know, they recorded us everywhere. They followed us and shadowed us. And you know, the first of all, the type of couple who would agree to have their divorce be on TV is in a very small subset of a very small subset. So you can, you know, it's like and I'll just leave it at that because obviously, you know, I still have a duty of confidentiality to my client. But let's just put it this way. It's entirely unique to give a client bad advice or good advice and for them to reject it and follow bad advice, and to have that happen on national TV. And I think at one point I was being told something that had happened and I was like, oh dear God. And I said, maybe she'll fire me. And then in the next episode, she fired me on national TV.
Oh, yes.
But my mother actually printed up every single comment that was put on the Dr. Phil website, and was like 235 pages. And she followed it avidly. And at one point, the opposing party's attorney, who is a very, very good friend of mine, which is how we ended up being on the case, said, you know, I will fight her on the beaches. I will fight, you know, like very, very aggressive, litigious behavior. And of course, you know, the audience ate it up. And my mother was absolutely horrified when I, you know, a couple of years later went into partnership with this attorney, and was just like, you know, how can you be her partner? And I was like, well, you know, actually we became extremely good friends. And for the last segment, we were taped in Los Angeles, and we had to get on the flight. And I have a terrible history of being late for things. I mean, I shouldn't say I've only been late for court twice. Once I went to the wrong courthouse, so that was sort of my defense. But the attorney called me up and said, like, look, you know, I want to pick you up because I don't want you to be late. And I had stomach flu, and I was like, I don't think I can go. Like, I have been unable to be away from my bathroom for more than, you know, 2 hours. Anyway, so she picked me up. I had a bottle of Imodium in one hand and a bottle of Pepto-Bismol in the other hand. And I literally was passed out in the back of her car and slept the entire way to Los Angeles. And it cemented a tremendous friendship, but the case itself was, was insane and challenging. And yeah, it was an interesting experience having everything recorded for like 3 weeks.
Well, that's a fascinating story. That's going to be very tough for our future podcast guests to beat. I think you've got them there. Nobody's been on Dr. Phil or anything like that. But what a fascinating discussion. I learned a lot. It was great doing this with you. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope that soon we'll be able to welcome you to the law school physically when this pandemic is over. I think our students and faculty would love to meet you in person.
Oh, I'd love to come back. I have the fondest memories of law school. And when you get your clinic sub and you have one on mediation and collaborative law, you give me a call. I'll help out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ann. And so that was Ann Gushurst on the UNB Law Podcast. And stay tuned for our next episode. Thanks again.
Thank you.